So while you're thinking, I've got a couple of questions that I'd love to thank you so much. And I think they've complemented one another and really been helpful. So can I start? I'm going to start with the most controversial question, I think, which I've noted here. You spoke about that slide that you didn't bring with the names, and you spoke about Peter Ball and John Smythe and Mike Pilavachi and so on and so on. They were all men. I'd love to hear your thoughts about, obviously women can abuse, but I do notice that many of these major figures are male, and I'd love to hear thoughts from any or all of you about that.
I don't mind starting. Well, clearly, there are more male leaders than female leaders in our churches. I mean, we just recognise that as a fact. I think it would be fair to say, if I think about our processes, the percentage is still skewed towards more men are likely to come across our processes than women. So recognising those two things mean that we see few women, we see mostly men, but obviously we have to recognise that there are more male leaders in our churches than there are female leaders. Yes. I mean, obviously, much of our process is not about senior level. It's about church ministers. It's about ministers that are perhaps chaplains or whatever. So from our processes, when we think about ministerial discipline, we aren't talking about those big names that we've all talked about today. We're just talking about ministers in local churches and local ministry opportunities. So, yeah.
I think I would start by saying that violence is gendered. It is. So we have to accept that, because it is. I think I'm just going to be really honest in my answer, because I feel quite passionately about some of this stuff. That male leadership is perpetuated, and therefore you're going to see males perpetuating harm. But I also think that I want to give the other side of that. That when we did the domestic abuse research, we asked people about what passages in Scripture contributed to domestic abuse. And Helen and I have had lots of conversations about this, but they quoted passages that you would expect people to quote, like headship of men, submission of women, and teaching on marriage and divorce and forgiveness. But those people in the survey that were male victims of domestic abuse said those passages were actually as harmful for them because their stories didn't exist in that model. And we know, if we look at other forms of abuse, like child abuse, that often there are female perpetrators, but there are all sorts of societal norms that prevent those who are abused by women from speaking out. So I think, again, what I would come back to is violence is gendered. We've got to look in our churches at how we set our cultures up and the roles of men and women within that. But I think we also have to look at this whole picture, because we want to address abuse wherever it happens and whoever it's perpetrated by.
I think perhaps the only thing that I'd add to that is spiritual abuse particularly is a relatively new concept for most to get their heads around. And we should not be, I mean, if you think about child sexual abuse within the church, it was, 25, maybe 30 years ago that we were first contending with the thought that might be a thing. And here we are with spiritual abuse in 2025. And it might be more comfortable for us to take things off the table which challenge us more. And I think the gender piece feeds into that. Whilst I think you're right, Lee, that the proportions of male versus female leaders is a key factor here. We're seeing more and more female leaders who are demonstrating some of these abusive behaviours. We should not think that it does not happen. It does. And it might always be to a lesser degree, potentially. But we should not kid ourselves that it does not happen.
Just on a very practical note, if I look back on 10 years of cases at the Baptist Union, I'd say we probably dealt with about half a dozen cases involving women. And in many cases, it was difficult to spot. It took a victim themselves to come forward and tell their story. In many cases, the complainant might not be the victim. We hear from someone else who has witnessed behaviour and become very concerned. I think all of our cases involving female ministers have been where the victim themselves has come forward. No one else has spotted the behaviour.
Thank you. Those are really helpful insights. Have we got questions from the floor yet? One down at the front here. Oh, another one.
Oh, there we go. There we go. I'm at the moment analysing live stream services from big evangelical charismatic churches in a certain area. And one of the things I'm noticing is the kind of theological emphasis on the congregation as surrendered, as submissive, as aligning to a particular theology in terms of being able to receive from God and being good disciples. How much impact do you think that sort of theological thinking has on people's ability to then stand up and not conform by telling their stories of what's going on?
It's really interesting. I think it's really important. And in the work of spiritual abuse, we see a lot of people talking about, they wouldn't use the word theologies. It's interesting. I think it's something that's come up for me a few times over the last few weeks about this word theology and how people think that's only the business of church leaders. But they might talk about what their teaching is. And one of the things in Justin's diagram that really we've used a lot when we've looked at this and people have talked to us is about that communication. What's being communicated from the front of church is what you're telling people matters. And so actually, if you're giving a message about submission and surrender, that's what you're saying matters in this context. But it's also about, are you inviting any questions? Are you inviting, is the style allowing somebody to come back and ask questions about that? And just an example I was giving to Justin, when we did the domestic abuse research, there was one person who wanted, a minister who wanted to preach about domestic abuse in their context, and they said they checked with the elders, and the elders said, oh, you don't need to do that. No one here has experienced that. We know everyone. But at the end, 9 women came forward to tell their story. What we do at the front of churches really matters, and it says what matters, but also the culture that we then have about what can you do in response to that. I don't know if anybody's ever been in a sermon where somebody stood up and said, I don't agree with that. That's not kind of how we do it. But what process is there for people to come and discuss, for people to come and ask questions, for people to come and debate? And that, I think that's a really interesting question about where we go in the future.
I did talk to a minister recently who did tell me that someone in his church did stand up and say you're preaching's crap, which was a bit harsh, I thought, for Sunday morning. That's a bit extreme. Look, I was brought up in that culture. You know, that's where I sat for a long time. I think you're right. I think if all we hear from the front is, whether it's that or other messages of power and control, whatever they might be, I would be concerned to be part of that. I'd be concerned if my family were part of that, and I would want to be in a culture where actually it's okay to ask questions and say, are you sure? I don't get this. I think that's important. And I think if we as church leaders aren't willing to do that, we need to look at ourselves and some of the things you've already said, Justin.
Absolutely, and I think we talked. I think you were talking, Helen, as we kicked off, about the power of societal change and its impact upon what we do as church, who we are as church. And I think it's important that if we're to recognise the statistics involved in those who experience harm and abuse, even within their childhood, let alone their lifetime, then as church, why are we not able to pick up that point of relevance and connection, and therefore weave that into the things that we communicate as leaders, as teachers, preachers, whatever we call ourselves. I remember not so long ago, I was at a well-known conference talking on these sorts of subjects, and said to the audience, which I think was probably 50 or 60 leaders from across the church spectrum, how many of you have either heard or preached a message underpinned by this notion of what it means to create a safer, healthier environment? And maybe 3 or 4 hands went up. And that said something to me, because it said, A, we're not being courageous. B, we're not actually listening to the experiences of those who come to our churches. And C, maybe there's something about a general relevance to society and community which the church at large is still failing to grapple with. So I think it's super important that whether it's our theologies, whether it's the way in which we invite people to speak into our church context, that we do something that is actually of importance and of value to people where they are at.
Interesting, just listening to your question there and listening to the answers, I was reflecting back on something that's part of our investigation practice. So often when we get accusations about a minister being controlling, coercive, overly dominant, bullying, harassing in style, one of the things that we do as a team is we go and we look at their sermons. So my colleagues have a lovely time listening to all sorts of statements made in sermons, but just literally sitting here thinking about that, I was thinking we do see a pattern of change. Maybe as someone realizes that they're closer to getting caught, their preaching changes. All of a sudden, their preaching is about the importance of going with the vision of the church, with the goals of faith that the minister has, the importance of banding together, not arguing, not disagreeing. Let's come with one mind on who we are and all we're about. And of course, that's part of the pattern of grooming. And maybe sometimes is a chance just to take away from the power of the congregation to ask difficult questions. I'm not happy about this. Why are we doing it this way? And instead say, no, actually, that's disobedience. It's disobedience for you to ask those questions. You should be focused on backing me as I lead the church. I hadn't thought of that till you asked that great question, Helen. Thank you.
I'm going to add something as well. Got a question from, great, I'll come there in a minute. I'm going to add something from my own thoughts as well about, not so much about abusive leadership, but about how we who are in church leadership speak about some of these themes which can land in ways that are harmful. And we just need to be really aware of how things can land. And we need to preach on forgiveness. It's at the heart of the Christian gospel, that we need to be aware of how that can be heard in certain contexts and how it can be misused in certain contexts. We need to preach on church unity, but we need to be aware of the way that it can be used coercively. We need to preach about submission to Christ, submission to one another out of reverence for Christ. But we need to be aware of how that can be heard, received in certain situations and how it can be misused. And another thing that I would say, and I say this to my students a lot, is don't use you language in the pulpit, use we language. I think we've got a question online, if you wouldn't mind running to the back, Louisa. Thank you.
I think I have a microphone. Oh, look at this.
Oh.
Special. This is from Jenny. And they address their question to Rachel and Lee. And they say, I think you mentioned that no one who knows a minister personally would be involved in a formal investigation. How would you suggest that smaller denominations, where everyone knows everyone, could proceed?
That's an excellent question. You have to start thinking about where are your connections, who are you linked to as a safeguarding team, where are others who would not know. There are very few situations in our denomination where we would come across a minister who all of us knew personally. We might have heard their name or read an article they've written, but we probably wouldn't all know them personally. The person who had a personal connection would step out. However, let's say it involved one of our 8 ministers at Didcot, a Baptist house where we work, where we do know those ministers more personally. We would step out and use an independent investigator. So I think if you're in a small denomination, get to know your counterparts in other denominations and get to know them well enough, this is a bit controversial, to know whether they're good at what they do. Get to understand the values that underpin the work that they do, and then use that opportunity to be able to help each other, or find independent investigators who have reputation and experience in dealing with cases that involve Christian communities.
Yeah, and there are organisations out there that can help you with that, I believe. Yeah, from our point of view, we often do find talking to other leaders in other denominations, they come to us and ask us questions. We go to them and ask questions. I think that's really healthy. We need to learn from one another. I was talking to somebody from another UK denomination recently, and they specifically want to ask me some specific information about our process. But the conversation was very much two-way and really helpful from my perspective as well. So yeah, I think everything Rachel said, and there are places out there that can help you with that for sure. Yeah.
Just on that, in the spiritual abuse work we've done, one of the sometimes the hallmarks of an experience of spiritual abuse is internal isolation. If you're not doing everything that's required of you, one writer calls it like a solitary confinement cell within a church. So you suddenly stop being invited to things, you stop being given special status. But also one of the other things we find is the reluctance to mix externally with any other church. And so you don't all have to worship together, but that sense that, we've got the real truth and don't go and mix with anybody else. And actually that means that you don't have the opportunity to see anything else other than that one truth that you're being presented with. So I think that's just really interesting in terms of that kind of working together actually can be a really healthy thing as a sort of means of seeing other realities, but also that kind of check that you've just talked about.
That's a really good point. Just wanted to come back to the issue of investigations specifically. I recall when the sole survivor process was running, there was quite a lot of public criticism of the fact that the Church of England were undertaking an investigation. And the term internal investigation was often used negatively. But actually, I think it's right that organisations are able to do that and should be afforded the opportunity to do that. Because if safeguarding responsibility is to sit as close to home as possible, it's right then that, let's say, the Baptist Union are enabled to undertake an internal investigation process. When we've got situations where churches are more insular, those similar to what you just described, Lisa, I think it becomes a little bit more tricky. Family connections are more apparent. So conflicts of interest are more tricky to navigate. In those situations, it may then be entirely appropriate that an independent external investigation is undertaken so that can be done impartially. So I guess the point I'm making is that investigation can look slightly different in different contexts, but where there is structure, resource that can do that, we should let that happen. It may be that something independent follows, but only once the initial work has been done. I think it's really important that we acknowledge that.
I'm almost nervous to ask this question in this context, but what about the allegations which are malicious? Where a congregant becomes infatuated with the vicar, and the impact on that pastor of having that allegation and the whole process of investigation, the impact on him, his family, and the congregation of something that is fallacious.
I've got the mic here. I think it's a good point that you make, and it's a point that's made reasonably often. The one thing that I would say is that statistically, malicious allegations are very much in the minority. Something around 5% or less allegations, once investigated, are discovered to be malicious or unfounded to some degree. So I think one of the points that Rachel, you made in your presentation about making an assessment as to when an individual needs to be stepped back, suspended, whatever phrase we might want to use, I think is really important here. And it's deliberately intended to be an impartial, neutral act. Now, I know that it probably doesn't feel that way for many who are subject to it, but it protects all parties. And I think it's important that we bear that in mind, that we afford everybody the opportunity to be able to explore what the facts of the matter are, insofar as we can do that, and to work forward from that point for the good of everybody. I think one of the other things that I would say about that is that in those small proportion of cases where it does appear to be malicious or unfounded, it's even more important that the pastoral support is available for that person. I would go as far as to say it's always necessary, but possibly more necessary in those sorts of situations. But we will never know often until we get to the end of a process what it is we're dealing with exactly.
Yeah, if I talk about our process specifically, we spend a lot of time risk assessing when something comes in. So if a complaint lands on one of us, which it normally does, we take the time to sit down and risk assess that carefully. We often perhaps will do some initial investigation work around that to see where that sits within our risk assessment and what we do or don't need to do next. Yeah, we do suspend people if we need to give that space and time. And you're absolutely right. I think pastoral support is really important. Sometimes we really struggle to support ministers in our process because they don't want to be supported, is the reality. But from our perspective, we would always want to offer as much support as is appropriate and possible from our perspective. But yeah, the statistics are the statistics, and the numbers are low in that regard, I think. But we would be mindful of that, clearly.
I would point out the difference between malicious and unfounded. There are times we receive complaints or allegations and they turn out to be unfounded. And what we mean by that is that we don't find evidence of abusive behaviour. We might find evidence of poor behaviour. Often that might be evidence of poor relationship, which might have deteriorated over some years between a minister and their congregation. It might be that we have a minister who is themselves very stressed, very busy, as congregational members who are in full-time jobs who are also stressed and busy, and things have got heated in a conversation, and we hope that that can be mended. That would be an unfounded allegation from my point of view. Someone has come to us genuinely concerned about how they're being treated by their minister, but we don't find evidence of abusive behaviour. Malicious is something else. A malicious allegation, if you think about it, is a decision to try and ruin someone's life. It is in any context, schools, health, etc. We don't see very many of those, I'm glad to say, but we do see a few where someone has set out to do harm to a minister, normally because they themselves feel that they have been slighted or undervalued or ignored, or they are just, I won't say every church has these because maybe yours don't, but in most of the churches I've attended over the years, there are people who just expect to be obeyed. They've just been brought up that way. If I say we do it, we do it. If I say this would be a good move for the church, who are you to disagree with me? Maybe people who over the years have held a lot of sway in church life, or their families have over several generations. And we often hear the phrase from people, safeguarding trumps everything. And in lots of ways, that's quite right, and that's good. It means you can cut through stuff and get to there's someone at risk of harm here. On the other hand, once in a while, someone will use that as an opportunity to try and get their own way, get their own back at a minister or leader. But personally, I think that is disgraceful. I think the idea of purposely choosing to slander and slur just to make your point is unacceptable. But I think, as Justin said, the numbers of cases where that happens are so very, very low. We work on the basis that if somebody contacts us, then there's something we need to seriously look at. Doesn't decide what the outcome will be, but that we should, if someone's come forward, then we should look at what they have to say.
And do you ever genuinely not be able to decide at the end of it? And if so, what do you do?
Yeah, wow, that's a big question. Our burden of proof is the civil burden of proof. So that's the balance of probabilities rather than beyond reasonable doubt, and rightly so. There are times where you really cannot find any supporting evidence either way. And that's really, really difficult. In that situation, we're looking to make sure that the person, the alleged victim, is safe and that the alleged perpetrator understands that their behaviour is under review. I'm sad to say that in the cases where that's happened, often we've seen a reoccurrence with a different victim within a couple of years. And at that point, we have a pattern. Okay.
Ashley had a question here at the front. And then then we've got two at the back. Thank you.
As a theological educator, it's something that rolls around in my mind that I'm kind of standing at the first gate of who's going to be the next round of ministry leaders. What are some things you wish we knew? What are some things you wish we would say to our students? How do you discern? I know there's no easy 3 steps to this. How do you discern between immaturity, which will be outgrown, and deeply concerning character flaws that should not be encouraged to have that sort of responsibility?
What I wish our theological educators, the people that are forming our ministers now, would say is accountability, accountability, accountability. Genuinely, if all of our ministers, Baptist ministers, had good accountability relationships, we wouldn't be out of a job, but our job would be less. Your second question, I think, is much more complex. This idea of how do we know if it's immaturity that someone will grow out of, or is there something there? I think that's far more difficult. I do sometimes question the way that we do our process. So I started life as a Salvation Army officer. And I had to do a psychological profile before I could go to the Salvation Army Officer Bible College. This is 30 years ago. We don't have that rigor in our Baptist family today. I know that had its own problems. One of my friends would regularly speak in tongues, and the psychological profile wasn't a Christian, and thought that they were hearing voices. So that in itself caused some issues. So there are things that we would need to overcome. But I would wish our processes were much more rigorous, and would give us the opportunity to try and push and delve. Of course, we're in such a position now in the UK that ministry numbers are so small that it's, we're really desperate to see people come into ministry. And that concerns me further, that actually we might be opening the door to people that perhaps we maybe shouldn't. Yeah.
I think it's it's a question I get asked a lot. The other side, I hope this isn't too controversial, and then maybe one of you will need to answer that, but it's that sometimes people talk to me about how they feel they've been harmed by the discernment process. and how is that done and who gets to make the decisions. And so I think that's really important. Are we transparent and open about that? Where's the accountability in that? I just feel like I need to say it because that's something that's often where people have shared stories with me. They've felt quite harmed by that process. The other thing I think is there's something about self-reflection that should be at the core, because actually we will all get it wrong. We will all get it wrong at some points in time, but our ability to self-reflect and change is key. So I think that what we often see is we might see behaviours at the lower end of that spectrum. And I think there's a challenge. This is why for me, cultures matters. There's a challenge to us. What do we do when we see behaviours at the lower end? We're not, I'm going to speak for myself. I might not be terribly good at bringing a respective challenge to behaviours at that lower end. And I think we need to think about that. What are we doing? How do we support people as well, where maybe they've made a mistake? How do we support them to do that differently in the future? So we can do that at that lower end of the spectrum. I think we've got a lot of work we could do down there that could help before behaviours escalate. But I think there is something about self-reflection. It's interesting to me that if I'm asked to go and talk at Bible colleges about spiritual abuse, quite often it's to a module that students will have chosen around pastoral care. Those are the very people who are interested in these issues. So there's something there as well that I think about what we teach that matters. But I think there is something about self-reflection that's so important.
I'd agree, and maybe just as a slight word of encouragement, in those environments where I've been asked to teach on these subjects, typically it is the younger, rising generations, Gen Z, millennials, who take a very different approach and have a very different understanding of the sorts of issues that we've been talking about today. I mean, that's not universal necessarily, but that's what I seem to find. So I'm not any longer trying to persuade people of the importance to explore the issues. It's done that already. Let's get to the substance of the issue, which I find refreshing. But one of the things that I will constantly be saying, and I think needs to be more evident in theological education, is, in part to your point, Lisa, the need for the deep personal work, because to step into ministry before you have given it sufficient time is not good for you, and it's not good for the people that you're going to be ministering to in time. So, do we understand the difference between self-awareness and self-reflection? I think it was Chuck de Groot, who may be familiar to many, said very recently in a conversation, it's not just about picking up a few books, reading it and thinking, oh, that was a great read, wasn't it? And popping it back on the shelf. We can call that self-awareness to a degree, or self-help. Self-reflection requires us to examine our responses to situations and to subjects, to understand why we've responded perhaps in a particular way to a given situation, and then where necessary to self-regulate to the point at which we know that the work has sufficiently been done for a reoccurrence not to be quite so likely in the future. So that sense in which we give ourselves to that personal work, I think, is something which really probably needs greater focus in all sorts of training, not just that you've referred to, I think.
I'm going to add that practically, I said earlier that we don't really remove a lot of students, but where we have, my sense would be that the significant issues in their characters might well have been assessed at an earlier point. I think the second thing I would say, and I'm really looking forward to Tim speaking about ministerial formation. I'm bigging you up here, Tim, but I'm really looking forward to it, is that it used to be that if you were in training as a minister, then while you were doing that formation, and probably for a while afterwards, you probably wouldn't be the sole minister in charge of a church. You'd have gone into a team-based ministry where someone older and wiser than you would be able to look over you, guide you, give you feedback, even in a simple congregational setting where that person who always moans about everything comes up to you and starts moaning and you want to get away. They're able to tell, do you have the grace, the humility, the patience? And we have a lovely document called the Marks of Ministry, which sets out the character traits we expect to see in our ministers. But I think that now certainly many of our ministers, as they're in training, are also in sole pastoral charge. It's really hard to get feedback in that situation. And I think there's something there about thinking, who can give you the direct message and who would you take that from? We were talking about that a little bit earlier on, but I do think there's an issue about who is watching over your journey while you're in formation on a daily basis.
Thank you. I think that is so true, Rachel. I was having a conversation with somebody not so long ago who made a very bold statement, but it struck me. The days of sole leadership are done. That's what they said in the context of these sorts of conversations. And in that environment that you speak of, Rachel, it does make you wonder if that is true, if what we're essentially saying is that being a sole leader with no accountability, no wise counsel or whatever it is, if those days are done, and perhaps they ought to be, what do we need to do where we find ourselves as essentially a sole leader to ensure that we have those safety mechanisms around us? I think it's a real challenge, isn't it?
I'll add something because I'm part of the team at the Bristol Baptist College, which works for the formation of the next generation of ministers. We've got 2 or 3 of our ministerial students here today. Tomorrow, they're all coming, so we're going to be double the size or more, which would be great. And I'm really looking forward, as Rachel's already said, to hearing from Tim, who will be speaking exactly to this question. But if I just chip in with a couple of thoughts in addition. I think it was you, Justin, spoke about time and about the importance of not rushing things. And I think that's really important for 2 reasons. Partly because there is the deep work that happens, and we are tough with our ministerial students, and those who are here will testify to that, I think. That we ask hard questions and we expect deep work, and you can't do that in 10 minutes. But the other thing that happens over time, so most of our students are with us for 3 years, some are with us for 4 years, is that we have time to do what I suppose I would call sifting. So that question of, is this immaturity or is this a serious character flaw? You can pull a wool over someone's eyes for a few weeks or months, perhaps. It's really difficult to pull a wool over someone's eyes over 3 or 4 years. And so I think there is important work there that you can't rush. And I suppose one more thing, which is that we're speaking 3 of us on this panel are Baptists, and some of us are bringing quite a lot of experience from the Baptist Union of Great Britain in. We're obviously, this is not a Baptist conference, this is an ecumenical conference, and it's not just a British conference, because I know we've got people joining us from Taiwan and India and other places as well, and the States and Canada. And I would say that in some parts of British church life, and definitely beyond as well, that people can train for the ministry effectively by just doing a theology degree, and that we would consider that is not sufficient, that is absolutely indispensable, but it is not sufficient. And alongside that theology degree, we need to do this hard, deep work of theological reflection, self-reflection, of being asked these deep questions. Right, we've got 2 questions from the back, and that's probably going to take us to, might well take us to the end.
Okay, so the first of those questions comes from Francis, and he asks a question to the panel. In your experience of working with churches and organizations, does abuse or harm look different in a complementarian setting rather than, or opposed to an egalitarian one?
And I'm just going to explain those terms because not everybody understands those terms. This relates to the theology of what women are allowed to do in church. And just very kind of in stark terms, churches that say women aren't allowed to teach or preach or perhaps take senior leadership positions hold what's called complementarian theology, which is men and women have complementary but not equivalent roles. And the other side is churches that might call themselves egalitarian, where they say women and men can equally respond to the call of God, and you know, God might call both, as it were. That's just very bluntly what people are thinking.
I think women's call to ministry is still often assessed by their own churches differently to that of men. I know many women who felt a call to ministry and have been encouraged to get involved in the Sunday school or the hospitality work in the church, whereas maybe I might feel that if a young man had been sensed that same call, they would have been supported for ministerial training. And our recent project Violet, which has looked at how women ministers' experiences, demonstrates that quite clearly. I think, having once been described as a troublesome woman by someone in my church, I think I took it that way. I would say that there is still an issue of women who are confident and capable and aware of that, standing up and getting on with work that needs to be done in church life. And I think that also affects how their complaints and concerns are heard in the church. That sense that a woman who is too intelligent, too competent, too confident is somehow seen as stepping out of place, therefore maybe needs just to be brought back in line a little bit. I'm just speaking from personal experience here. I'm not commenting on behalf of the Baptist Union. But I do think that sometimes it can be that sense that a woman who challenges or speaks up has a tougher time being heard. I say that as a lay member of churches, not as a minister.
As a minister who's also married to a minister, so my wife is an accredited Baptist minister as well, what at times I've been described as being a good leader, different words have been used about her, ones that are less appropriate. And that's in churches that would see themselves as being open to both men and women, because she was the pastor of the church where that was actually said of her by a member of the congregation, who himself was a retired Baptist minister. So it was a complex situation. But what he might have described me as being a good, competent leader, he chose to use different words about her. And that's challenging. And if we think then about some of the research that Project Violet has shown us, in an organization that is predominantly open to ministry for both men and women, the women in our denomination, the Baptist Union, have found things to be difficult, have found our processes more complex, have found our churches less welcoming, have found our elders and deacons more difficult to work with. So I think that it is difficult. Yeah.
I wonder if and I don't feel equipped to answer this, so maybe you'll I wonder if the question is more, was it more focused on, are we more likely to see abuse in different contexts? I wondered if that was I don't know.
I don't know either, but I could assume that maybe the question is about, do you find more abuse in one particular theological system than the other, or is there a correlation between reports in one? Yeah.
I think I can't answer that because I haven't done that work, so I can't answer that. I'm going to answer it slightly differently to say, not as a woman in the Baptist church, but as a woman speaking out about abuse in the church. Is it difficult? Yeah. I think it is difficult because, and it's been said to me, if you were a man, we would listen to you. I've actually had that said to me. If you were a man, we would listen to you. So I think there is something there about it. But I also was reflecting with some of my friends the other week. It's often women that do work on abuse, not solely, but often women that do work on abuse. I do know from the domestic abuse research we did that some people really found that where there was that headship of men was really strong, that was part and parcel of their experience and made it very difficult to speak out about. But a number of people, and I think it comes back to what you said earlier, talked about how passages are taught, and it's so important how messages are taught. And I would absolutely agree that where you know that you're speaking, so if you're speaking about women, our submission of women, and you know that those passages can be used as part of people's experiences of abuse, give voice to that. It's not enough to just know it. You have to talk about it. You have to give voice to it. And actually something that was really powerful in our own context was when our minister was really explicit about this is not a mandate for abuse. And he was really clear about it. He didn't use those exact words, but he was really clear. And I listened to Helen talk about this a couple of years ago, and it was just so refreshing for me to hear somebody say, the Bible doesn't tell you so. But we don't often hear those words from the front of church, and I think it's really important that we do.
Thank you. Last question then, I think, from the Zoom chat. And obviously, hopefully, you guys are going to be here tomorrow, so conversations can continue, and I'm sure they will continue over the next couple of days.
Great. This question comes from Sarah. They say, from my limited experience of hearing personal stories of spiritual abuse or unhealthy church cultures, it's concerned me that many victims are told by regional or national denominational safeguarding teams that they are not, quote, vulnerable adults, so no action can be taken. Whilst we can follow the Safer Places pledge, how can we realistically support victims in their healing journey when the organizational structures seem to silence this abuse?
So just for clarity, they're told that they are not vulnerable adults, so nothing he's doing. Is that what's...
Yes.
Okay.
It appears.
There you go.
Thank you for that, Lee.
You'll be able to define vulnerable, won't you? I hope.
There are times when you receive a set of allegations, someone tells you their story, and it is very clear that they are not in a position where they could stand up for themselves with any degree of confidence. And that might well be a situation where they are what we would describe as an adult at risk. That means for a whole possible range of circumstances, some to do with themselves and their health or the way they deal with the world, some about the context and circumstance in which they live. They just don't have the wherewithal to be able to step up and say, that's not acceptable, or no, I won't accept being treated like that. And those people, in my mind, deserve special consideration. We treat them as adults at risk under the legal definitions. They are often people who need specific support, sometimes in daily life, sometimes on a temporary basis. So, for example, we would regard somebody who's recently been bereaved, recently lost their spouse, as being an adult at risk for normally about a year after that loss. On the other hand, there are people who just feel that the minister has more power than they do. And in some cases, it's about finding someone who can support you and step up and walk with you during that. I think sometimes people write to us and they basically say, I am an adult at risk because when my minister doesn't agree with me, I feel unsafe. And those words, safe and unsafe, are used in lots of settings these days. The word trauma is a very similar one, isn't it? Someone will say, this has traumatized me. And our definition of that word, in the same way that the word stress went from being a medical term to being a daily use term, I think that trauma is heading in the same direction sometimes. I think for us, it's about saying we cannot get to everybody. So what are we going to prioritize here? So it's not that we want to say to people who are finding it difficult with their minister, we're not interested in you. It's just about, we recognize that the solution for those people might be more local, that they've actually got the wherewithal and the ability and the intelligence and the capability to be able to gather a group around them and address it. It's not a perfect answer, I'm aware of that. But so for example, there are 5 of us in my team. in ministries dealing with these issues. There's Lee and his colleague. That's 7 of us for almost 2,000 Baptist churches. And we do inevitably have to make some choices about what we think people might be able to respond to with local help and what actually needs intervention at our level.
I was sat here debating whether to be controversial or not. So, and now I've said that clearly, I'm going to be, obviously. I think sometimes people try and use language to make us do things. So people will try and tell us that something is safeguarding because they think that word trumps everything else. And clearly, we need to be very clear. We need to be very cautious. We need to be very mindful about every situation that comes our way. But just because someone says it's safeguarding, it doesn't always necessarily mean to say that actually it is safeguarding. Now, I use that as an example and not the other deliberately because I don't want to provoke the person that's asked the question. I'm just trying to explain how we find ourselves and the situation that we have to consider. As an organisation, when we step into situations, we always look to make sure that we do give appropriate pastoral care to both the victim or victims and also the perpetrator, because at the point that we step in, we probably don't know what the outcome of the investigation is going to be, and so it's right and proper to give the correct help and support to everyone. So I would hope that someone that comes across our processes would get the appropriate pastoral support, and we seek to engage with those people in ways that would provide that.
I'm possibly going to be a bit more controversial. I think this is a really complex one. In the work, obviously there are statutory definitions that have to be worked with. But if you experience harm and abuse and you're not categorised as an adult at risk of harm, it still has a huge impact on you. And I think we've got some way to go to know how to work properly. So when we've done reviews on cases of spiritual abuse, if you are continually controlled and coerced and faith is used as part of that, whether or not in statutory definitions you can speak up for yourself is entirely different to if you actually can in that moment. I'm just going to be really honest. I'm a professor at a university. I experienced spiritual abuse and it took me a jolly long time to talk about it. So I think we have something that is more that needs to be done. So that person that asked that question online, we've got more that we need to do.
I think I'd agree with all of that. And I think there is something quite unhelpful in the ways that we often are encouraged to define vulnerability. So we've got the statutory definitions that we've referred to. You are only a vulnerable adult if you meet these criteria. We've got various different definitions for vulnerable adult in various different laws across the UK, never mind internationally. Different definitions that apply in different contexts and settings. So how are we to be clear? How are we to apply those equitably and fairly? But I suppose the question that I would ask myself and maybe throw back into the conversation is, if you are a person who doesn't tick the boxes to be within the definition of vulnerable adult, are you then not able to be harmed or abused? I think we know the answer to that question. No, I know that's not what we're saying. But I think in our context, we need to think more broadly about what vulnerability looks like. It can be temporary, transient, as much as long-standing and enduring. It may not be easy to categorise. It may not involve statutory services. It may do. So I think the challenge that is brought to the church often is how do we ensure that we are able to attend appropriately to those people who have suffered harm and abuse, irrespective of whether they meet a statutory definition or whatever else. And to the point that was made about how do we therefore speak up, I think in relation to the pledge that I referred to, I think it's so important. Oftentimes, we may find that individuals don't feel that they have the voice or the platform, whatever it might be, to share their experience. Oftentimes they do. They've just not been listened to on countless occasions when they have tried to bring voice to their experience and have somebody respond appropriately. So sometimes it is about speaking up on behalf of, sometimes it's about opening the door, offering the platform, creating the opportunity, and if not needed, getting out of the way, so that those people are able to give voice to their experience. So I think it is deeply complex, as we've said, but I personally do not think we should limit ourselves to purely statutory definitions of what a vulnerable adult or an adult at risk might be. I know that presents issues, and I know it brings challenge. I've been there.
And I'm not sure that's what we were saying. No, I appreciate that, but I do think it's important for us to recognise that labels are difficult, but from our perspective, we would want to make sure that whoever comes to us does get the opportunity to be supported well and correctly.
I think one of the key factors for me, if someone wouldn't meet a statutory definition, would be about the power imbalance between the person who is being accused of being abusive and the person who is bringing those allegations. Sometimes it is so easy to see that one person holds all the power. And I think in that case, we are more likely to see the need for us to intervene because we're not in the same power structure. We're not at that church. But there are also times when you just see people, we've talked about before, about using the word safeguarding as the idea of, well, I can get the big guns in if I use that word. I don't say that lightly, but I think there are times when we feel that someone is trying to rope us in because they think that we might be able to exercise more power in that situation. I think it's very sad that many people at local level feel that if they raised something, then no one else in the church would stand with them. And there's a challenge in there for leadership teams about how they might respond to an issue. The temptation is everybody gathers around the minister, but actually maybe there should be some more thought to what does pastoral and practical support look like for someone in need.
Thank you. I'm awed, genuinely awed by the wisdom and the experience and the passion and commitment of the people on this panel. I'm so grateful to you for all that you've brought this afternoon. Can we show our appreciation? Feel free to stay or to take a seat. I'm just going to close this out for a couple of moments. But so before we finish, just to remind you that we will be back here again at 9 o'clock tomorrow, and very much looking forward to hearing tomorrow's speakers. I'm going to invite us just to keep some silence for a moment, because there's been some hard stories, there's been painful stories, perhaps recollections, and we were all going to connect with those stories in different ways. For some of them, these are our stories. For others, these are stories of people we love. Let's just hold this space and hold before the Lord any situations or contexts we personally know, or that we carry a sense of burden for. And I don't know if you're angry, but I've certainly been very angry at times this afternoon. And we bring that anger before God, who actually cares more than we do and rages more than we do when his little ones are harmed. So a blessing and prayer from the Franciscan community. May God bless us with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths and superficial relationships, so that you may live deep within your heart. May God bless us with anger at injustice, oppression and exploitation of people, so that you may work for justice, freedom and peace. May God bless us with tears to shed for those who suffer pain or rejection, hunger and war, so that you may reach out your hand to comfort them and to turn their pain to joy. May God bless us with enough foolishness to believe that we can make a difference in the world, so that we can do what others claim cannot be done, to bring justice and kindness to all our children and the poor. And Lord, will you grant rest and peace to us tonight? Will you grant us the possibility to lay down some of the anger and some of the burden that we perhaps have been experiencing this afternoon, so that we might experience rest and return tomorrow for continuing learning and conversation. So may God bless us. Amen.